The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. I was fangirling in the green room, and I don't apologize for it. Have you read the Paris novel? Anybody yet? Oh, okay, that's a lot already. That's fantastic. For those of us who have not, those of they who have not, how would you describe it to somebody who hasn't read it yet?
Well, it is basically about a very repressed young woman who goes to Paris, tries on a vintage dress, and it changes her life. And it is ultimately about the transformative power of pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. So it sprang from an anecdote in your memoir, Save Me the Plums. Your editor, the late Susan Campbell, who I know you loved, always wanted you to write about this anecdote. What was her instinct? Tell us about the true moment this is based on.
Okay, so in Save Me the Plums, which is about my years at Gourmet, I wrote about when we did the first Paris novel, which was amazing because, magazines don't sell out. You always, for newsstand, you sell out, you print twice as many as you expect to sell for the newsstand. We sold out. There was not a copy. People were calling and saying, please, 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 I must have a copy of that issue. And one of the things I wrote about in that issue was going into this great vintage clothing store in Paris. And the sales lady said, I have your dress. And she insists that I try on this amazing confection. And I look in the mirror, and I am everything I have ever wanted to be. I am glamorous. I look like, an aria is going to come out of my mouth. I mean, I look nothing like myself. And I desperately want to be the person in the mirror. And I say to the woman, how much is my dress? And she says, let me go talk to the owner. This dress was meant for you. And there's a lot of rapid French, and she comes back and she says very excitedly, Didier wants you to have the dress. It's only 50,000 francs. And I do the math, and 50,000 francs is $6,000. And I say to her, this is not my dress. and this is a true story. And Susan said, I so wanted you to buy that dress, and I didn't care that it cost $6,000. And don't you think you could write a novel where the character buys the dress and it changes her life? And in the moment that she said that, the book came to me. I mean, nothing like that has ever quite happened to me before, but I knew all these characters I wanted to put in the book. I knew when I wanted to set the book, and it was just this incredible gift that she gave me, and it really hurts me that a few months later, very unexpectedly, Susan passed away. And so she will never read this book.
So she never got to read any part of it?
Not a word.
I wondered if the title came from how you referred to it. Like, when are you going to write that Paris novel? The Paris novel.
No, I mean, the title really just came because we kept referring to it as the Paris novel as kind of a placeholder. And then they said, well, what are you going to call it? And I was like, the Paris novel.
How about the Paris novel? So your heroine is called Stella. She tries on the magical dress. How much Ruth is in Stella?
Almost none. I mean, I really wanted to write a character who was nothing like me. Stella has had a very traumatic childhood. The only way she can feel safe in the world is to have shut everything down. I mean, she has, in order to survive, she lives by routine. She does the same things every day. She makes plans. She never deviates. She doesn't really allow herself any pleasure. She does it She doesn't like food, or, I mean, and she's a copy editor. And, you know, copy editors, as you know, are very detail-oriented people. And she is this sort of mousy young woman who is like never even really allowed herself to have friends because friends won't be safe. And that is not me.
I've known her for 3 minutes, and I can attest to the fact that that is not her. It's such a delightful book, and I mean that literally. It's full of delight. And you say that you had too much fun writing it. Do we devalue books that are lovely, that are fun? Do we feel like, oh, they're not important enough if they're delightful?
We do. You know, we really, I mean, my first husband used to talk about free reading books and then books that you had to read. And it's like there's something kind of pejorative in free reading books. And books that you read because they're fun are free reading books. I have to say that for me, books are necessary and probably my drug of choice. It's like I feel like I need to get out of my own head for a little bit every day. And the only way I really know how to do that is through a book that really is transporting. So I value these kinds of books enormously. And I will tell you the moment when I really understood how powerful they can be. I did something incredibly stupid and scratched holes in both my corneas in Italy about 10 years ago. And you have more nerves in your eyes than anywhere. It is excruciatingly painful, and there is nothing they can do for you. They can't give you drugs. They can't really do anything. And you just have to wait it out. And I would have gone out of my mind if I didn't have books to listen to. I mean, the kind of books that took me away. And I thought, there is real value in this.
I also think delightful is not easy. People think it's easy. Ha 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 ha. Try it. It seems to me that you went down a couple of rabbit holes with your research in this book. It seemed to me like the research part was very fun for you. Were there particular stories that just kind of like sucked you in?
Many, but I mean, that is for me part of the real joy of writing fiction. I mean, for Delicious, I also went down endless rabbit holes and wrote whole scenes that never got into the book. But in this one in particular, you know, I never knew, when I was growing up, there was no career called food writer. So I never thought, oh, I can take this great love I have for food and writing about food and cooking. There's no way I can make that into a career. So I studied art history, and I have a master's in art history. And when I was getting my master's, when I was doing the Impressionism part, I was very taken with Manet's Olympia. And, you know, you look at this extraordinary painting, and here is this woman who takes her clothes off. And, I mean, she is a prostitute, and she is looking out at you with the most judgmental look. She is, she's a force.
Yeah, it's the anti-male gaze painting, really. Yeah.
Yeah. And what we learned is that she somehow became an artist in her own right. And she showed in the Salon 6 times, and not one of her paintings still exists. And I wanted to write my master's thesis on the model Victorine. I mean, and for a woman, and a working class woman, to have become an artist in 1876, women weren't admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts. Every woman painter of that period that we have heard of was a wealthy woman who was privately educated. They totally would have looked down on this woman who took her clothes off for painters. How did she manage to make herself a painter? How did she do that? And what became of her? And none of my professors thought this was a proper
I'm shocked. I'm shocked to hear that.
So the minute Susan said this, one of the things I thought is, oh, this is my moment to go down the Victorine rabbit hole. I'm going to try and find out what happened to her and make her a part of this book.
I hope you sent a copy of the novel very sweetly inscribed to these professors too. It'd be great for them to get that. Why, I mean, I know this is a huge question, but I would love to hear your take on this. Why is Paris different from other great cities? Why is it different from New York or London or Rome or?
Well, for a few reasons. I mean, for one thing, they haven't ruined it. You know, I mean, it is still, you know, very much the Paris I knew as a kid. I mean, it you know, so it hasn't changed in the 70 years that I've been going there. And, you know, and so many, especially for Americans, I mean, so many of the great American writers went to Paris in the 20s, and it sort of lives in our imaginations, and you can walk down the streets and think, you know, F. Scott Fitzgerald walked down this street. Gertrude Stein was here. Hemingway was here. I mean, and then so much of the art that we love is set in Paris. So, you know, if you're someone who goes to museums, Paris is kind of inside of you.
And some of those cafes are literally still there.
And
which is
some of the
really
cafes
amazing.
are still, yes.
Your book is full of descriptions of spectacular sounding meals. And I wonder if you could share any of your stories of, like, maybe one from when you were, you know, young and broke, and one from when you had some gourmet money. Like, do you have some great memorable Paris meals that stand out?
Well, the most memorable Paris meals are every meal in that book is something that I actually ate. And one of the reasons I chose to set the book in, when I chose it in the early 80s, is I first started writing restaurant reviews in the mid-70s. But I was a freelance writer. I lived in a commune in Berkeley. I could not afford to go out to eat unless some publication sent me there. So, you know, if they paid the expenses, I could go. But I was probably the only restaurant critic in America who had never eaten a 3-star French meal. And in 1984, when I got the job as the restaurant critic of the LA Times, the first thing I said to my new boss is, "What's my expense account?" And he said, "We will let you know when you go over your limit." And they never did.
Woo!
I mean, this
The
was
80s, baby.
Yeah. and the LA Times was known as the Velvet Coffin. I mean, there was one reporter there who spent an entire year working on one story. I mean, money. It was another time. Well, you were at Condé Nast in those days
yes,
too.
I was spending someone else's money then too.
But so the first thing I said was, I'm going to go to Paris. So, you know, in 1983, I went to Paris and said, and so I did go to L'Espérance, and I did go for lunch and stay through dinner. And that meal is in there. And one of the meals that's not in the book, but which I will tell you about, because it was like such an extraordinary experience for me. L'Ami Louis is a very big part of the book. The meal that she has there is kind of the first really good meal she ever has, and she doesn't appreciate it. But L'Ami Louis is this bistro that has been there since 1923, and it's virtually unchanged, and they still cook over wood fire, and the film community loves it. Francis Ford Coppola once cooked me a L'Ami Louis meal. But I could never get in there. It's impossible to get in. And when my son was 8, we were going through Paris. We were on our way home from Italy. And on a whim, on our one night in Paris, I called up to see if we could have a reservation. And they said yes. And I was shocked. I almost dropped the phone. My husband is not an eater. I mean, so the idea of going out for a big fancy French meal wasn't his idea of a good time. And Nick was 8, and he wasn't real. And I said, no, we are going to Les Louis. And we go in there, and the first thing that the maitre d', he looks at Nick, and he says, I bet you'd like some French fries. And he brings him this huge pile of the most perfect French fries you've ever had, and a glass of orange juice. And Nick says, I think this is going to be fun.
Oh, how sweet.
And then it was filled with French film stars and their families. And the maitre d' organized the kids to go outside and play games in the street. So there is a reason why I have those kids in the book, jumping up and down, looking inside.
Yeah.
And at one point, Nick came running in and he said, the woman upstairs is calling the gendarmes. He ran outside again. And the whole restaurant turned into kind of a party. We all just sort of started walking around from table to, all our kids were outside playing, and we were walking around from table to table. And it was, for me, one of the most amazing ideas of how a restaurant can turn into a party.
That's beautiful. My mind is blown that your husband's not an eater. How have you not convinced him with your delicious cooking?
He's a news guy. He was the news director. He's at CBS for most of his career, and he thinks food is kind of
Fuel.
silly. Which is like, if you're a restaurant critic, it is it's such a princess job. People come up to you and say, if you're at the New York Times, I read you religiously. Mm-hmm. And, had to have someone like Michael who's going, oh, get over yourself. It's very helpful.
Oh, God. Women are always so grateful when someone keeps them grounded. Let's have the ones that soar a little bit. See, I don't think I taste food the way you taste food. Your descriptions in this novel and in Save Me the Plums, there is a are you familiar with this term? I can't say synesthesia, where you sort of see the taste. You talk about the thrum of beef and the reverberation of, sauce or whatever. The lemon is a high thing. You taste a mushroom and you see a forest in the fall sunshine. I think that's so beautiful. But when was the first time you remember that happening to you?
As a food writer, we have very few words to describe flavor. So if you want to be a food writer, you have to really think about food in terms that go into sensation, into color, into music. I was in a certain way very lucky. I had a mother who was taste blind, and the first chapter in my first book, Tender at the Bone, is about my mother inviting people to an engagement party for my brother and putting 26 of them in the hospital with food poisoning. And my earliest memory is sitting in my high chair watching my mother scraping the blue stuff off of the top of every dish in the refrigerator and saying, little mold never hurt anyone.
Before you could speak and say, help, help, help.
So my mother trained me to be a restaurant critic, actually. I learned at a very young age to taste very carefully.
In both senses of the word.
In most senses of the word. And when you do that, you really do start thinking about food in bigger ways. And I genuinely believe that there's so many horrible things happening in the world all the time, at any moment. But it really behooves us as human beings to find moments of grace where we can. Mm-hmm. And for me, a lot of those is in, a perfect peach. So many moments come from just appreciating the fact that you're alive. And for me, so many of those come from food. And so it just is, it's natural to me to think about food in that way and to try and explain it to other people so that they can experience that too.
Well, success. So you mentioned your mother. What kind of a kid were you? Were you adventurous? You grew up in Greenwich Village. Was your dad into food? Like,
So my father was a book designer, and neither of my parents were particularly interested in food except in an intellectual sense. My mother, obviously a terrible cook, but she was a curious person. So, she would go down to Little Italy, and I remember, one day, this is also in Tender at the Bone, but, I opened the refrigerator and there's a suckling pig sitting in there. And my mother had been wandering the streets of Greenwich Village and she saw a suckling pig in Ottomanelli's, and she'd never seen a suckling pig before, and she brought it home. And then she said to me, I was like 8, figure out how to cook this. And I was also, my parents were older parents. My dad was 50 when I was born. My mom was 40. And they went out to eat a lot, and they didn't change their pattern because of me. So we went to restaurants a lot when I was growing up. And then my father and I used to walk the city on weekends. And we would walk to Chinatown, to Little Italy, up to Yorkville, through La Marqueta. And I loved watching people eating. And I understood early that it was a way that people went home. My father was German, and he would go up to Yorkville. And it was like how he went back to Germany.
Your earlier reviews at the New York Times, I remember there was, controversies, maybe too strong a word, but you were writing about little Asian restaurants and little Latino restaurants. People were not doing that.
Well, it was a real shock to me after living in California for 20 years, where, the West Coast looks to Asia and it looks down to Latin America. The East Coast, at least up until that point, I went back to New York in '93, was still looking to Europe. And they, the critics in New York didn't really think that a restaurant was a serious restaurant unless it was, French, Italian, or German. And I've been living there and eating Japanese food and Thai food and Mexican food, and it was all in New York. And I really, again, I genuinely believe in the power of food, and I think, as a restaurant critic, one of your jobs is to get people out of their safe zone to taste things they haven't tasted before, and to discover what there is in their city, right? And so, my second review at the New York Times was of a little soba place. It happened to have been an almost perfect restaurant. They were very Japanese in the sense that they served very few things, very small menu, but everything was perfect. And soba is very hard to make because it's made with buckwheat. They're noodles made with buckwheat, which has no gluten. So it's a real art to making great soba. And it was my second review there. I gave it 3 stars, and there was this outcry in New York. Oh my God, she's giving 3 stars to little Japanese noodle joints. But it is still, sadly, that restaurant is no longer in New York, and I miss it terribly.
Yeah, if it's good, it's good. Yeah. Okay, so the Paris novel is a big mother-daughter story. The mother in the book is a doozy. of a mother.
She is a doozy.
You had a complicated mother. What was your relationship like with her?
With my mother?
Yeah.
My mother was, so when I wrote Tender at the Bone, my then editor said, there's something you're not saying. There's a secret hidden in this book, and I don't know what it is. And I said, well, I've been trying to make my mentally ill mother kind of an Auntie Mame character. I don't want to out her. And Anne said, it's not working. You've got to do it. My mother was no longer alive. I would not have done this if she was alive. But I talked about the fact that she was severely bipolar. She had crazy manic periods where, she wouldn't sleep for weeks on end and go on crazy buying sprees where one day, and my family was not wealthy at all, but one day my mother bought a new house, a fur coat, a Chris Craft boat, a very expensive painting, and a diamond ring.
In one day?
In one day. Wow. That is crazy mania. And it all had to go back except for the house, which could not because she had signed for it. Wow. So we had to sell the house we had. And but she, so like the party in the book where she, I've toned it down some, but it was truly insane. She invited 150 people to an engagement party for my brother, and then she made it somehow a fundraiser for UNICEF. And
what was the item that poisoned everybody?
She bought. She made a crab meat soup.
Oh, okay.
And we didn't have refrigeration for 150 people, so it was just sort of. She also, and this is a true story. She came back she went out shopping, and she came back, and she had gone to Horn and Hardarts, and they sold the leftovers from the automat, everything that hadn't sold, and she brought back hundreds of little different containers of things, and her idea was we could just stir it all together.
Okay.
She was, but may I say, she was also brilliant. She got a PhD at 19. She had a 40-year correspondence with Bertrand Russell. And she was also generous enough to say to me, don't be like me. You need to have a career. I've never really been able to work because of my illness, but and there was deep generosity in her too. She's not at all like Stella's mother, who is a true horror.
Yeah, Stella's mother is just a proper narcissist. But I wondered if writing, her name is Celia in the book, I wondered if writing her resolved anything for you. Like, was there a place where you could take Celia, where you could write about a mother that was so different from yours that you could actually enjoy her bad behavior?
I do enjoy Celia, and actually I'm writing a sequel to the
great.
Paris novel where I'm looking into Celia's background, because there's something kind of wonderful about her. She is a woman who grew up in a very Italian family and decided she wanted something better and just walked out of her raucous, very working class household at the age of 15 and invented herself completely. And she's kind of amazing. She just happens to be a terrible narcissist, but
She just maybe shouldn't have been a mother.
she should. And as she said, she never really meant to be anybody's mother.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We talked a little bit about women and ambition earlier, but was yours did you yourself ever censor your own ambition? Was it ever hard for you to admit that you wanted to have like a big platform, that you wanted to have a voice?
I think it's very hard for most women. I mean, we are trained to be nice. We are trained to be good girls, and I think it has been hard for me to accept how ambitious I am.
That's interesting.
But I think what I've learned as I've gotten older and that's a little bit maybe what Save Me the Plums is about learning to be a boss, that being ambitious does not mean that you can't be nice.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. I reread Save Me the Plums right before we met, and you took on Gourmet and Condé Nast, the company that owned Gourmet, at age 50. And I wonder if being that age helped you kind of remain yourself while you were there and not get too Condé Nastized or intimidated or changed or...
Well, I don't think I have it in me to be Condé Nastized. I mean, I'm too much a creature of the counterculture all that Condé Nast stuff seems so silly to me.
For anyone who doesn't know, Vogue is one of the publications, Vanity Fair, and when I worked there was a woman at Vogue whose coat buttoned up the back. And I thought, okay, that's Condé Nast right there. Like, does she wander around at night waiting for someone to unbutton her? Like, but that's the way they live their lives, right? It was like very bento box sushi at lunch coming up in the elevator and stuff like that. But
yeah, but also, I became friends with a lot of the drivers at Condé Nast, and the stories they would tell me about what editors did. Just thoughtless stuff like spilling coffee in the back of their cars and not even thinking to clean it up, leaving their garbage in the car. It's one of the joys of running a magazine at Condé Nast was that somebody once explained it to me that he thinks of these different magazines as studios, and so he lets you run it however you want. And I'm very much a believer in collaboration, and I think the idea that, I think about Tina Brown, who famously, at midnight would tear up the New Yorker, and it would go to press. She would have changed everything, and the editors wouldn't recognize it. I always thought it was more important for everybody on the staff to feel like they had ownership in the magazine than for me to think that everything in it was perfect.
And you're right, you can be the boss and not be mean about it. Like, you can actually be in control. And I wonder if do you have advice for leaders, especially women leaders? Is there a piece of advice that you're free to dole out?
The biggest piece of advice I have is just remember, everybody who's working for you, you will work for them one day. Keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's very true in my case. So if Gourmet were still around and you were still the editor, what do you think you'd be writing about now? What's really grabbing you about what's happening in food right now?
Oh my God. Well, I just did this film during COVID. I did a film called Food and Country, which is about how broken the American food system is. And there is so much to write about. This film is mostly about farming, and it is almost impossible to farm in America. We have no respect for the people who raise our food, and we have made it so difficult. And the consequences of, the American food policy, at the end of World War II, the United States decided that the best way to fight communism would be to have the cheapest, most abundant food in the world. And everything that is wrong with America basically comes from that policy, in my opinion. We've destroyed our health, we've destroyed our communities, we've destroyed the environment. It's appalling. And I would be we would be doing all of that. We would be, I genuinely believe that one of the things we need to do is personalize the stories of the people who raise our food, personalize the stories of immigrant workers, and I would be doing a lot of that to try and even make fictional stories of people so that, I mean, the American food system basically runs on the backs of undocumented workers. And their lives are horrible.
Yeah.
And, I mean, obviously one of the great things about a magazine like Gourmet is you get to balance the pleasure, right? All the great recipes and, the beautiful photo shoots and the wonderful, delicious writing about food with the really serious stuff, because it all belongs together in one place.
And you shouldn't forget where your food comes from.
You really should not.
I'm going to ask you just 2 more questions, and then we're going to open it up, and people can, there will be mics passed around. But, I read on the weekend, the New York Times did a piece on spoiled taste buds. There's too much flavor in our food now,
That was not a very good piece.
but it's such it's this whole idea of food as a function of opulence, food as, like, my phone eats first, I got to take a picture of everything. Like, how do you feel about that whole phenomenon?
Well, I grew up in an America that did not care about food at all. And I don't care how people fall in love with food. If it means that they're going to take pictures of their food, fine with me. I mean, how we became a food culture in America was basically through food television. And it was really stupid when it started, right? It's not anymore. It's like, we graduated from, really dopey shows to, Tony Bourdain traveling the world and saying, care about these people, and Chef's Table, which is really beautiful. And I don't care why people are interested in food. I just love the fact that they are.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I'll try not to be irritated by the irritating people. In Save Me the Plums, you write about your friend Stevie, who had a talent for happiness. And I want to know, do you think of yourself as a person who has a talent for happiness?
My husband says I was born with too much serotonin. But I also think, I genuinely wake up every morning grateful that I'm not my mother. And the fact that she really didn't have the ability to be really happy, it was chemical with her. And I have it. And I just feel so lucky.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with the audience.